Right guys, so today what I'm going to show you is how to connect to a Salesforce instance with an AWS Lambda, retrieving case data given that we send the AWS Lambda function a client ID. What you see on your screen is a Python script in AWS Management Console. On the left hand side you've got environment variables specifying your different parameters that we're going to use that I'll explain later. At the bottom the output of the actual Lambda, which is the case data, and on the right we have a sample request body that we're going to send the Lambda function. As you can see, there's just the client ID in the request body. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to have to create a connected app that is going to be used to connect to Salesforce. So you're going to go to your setup menu, you're going to go app manager, and from the app manager menu you're going to select new connected app. Click create connected app. Okay, we're going to use test connected app. Let's just put a random contact email, and then we're gonna make sure that the enable OAuth settings is set. Then we're going to need to put in a callback URL. I'm going to just use this one. Then under your available OAuth scopes, we're going to need to, for this example, select full access and perform requests at any time. Now, normally you would scale down the permissions based on what you want to do with the connected app, but for this example, we're going to use these two options. Then you're going to click save. It's going to tell you that it takes 10 minutes to take effect. Click continue. Then it's going to take you to the screen, and what's important is you're going to need to click manage consumer details in order to see your consumer key and secret. Now your consumer key and secret you're going to use as parameters to connect to Salesforce from your AWS Lambda. Some verification will be required, and then on the following screen you'll see the consumer key and secret. Keep these safe somewhere, but you can always access them from the app manager menu anyway. Remember also that for this example I've set up the connected app so that all users may self-authorize. You can also allow an admin to determine who authorizes through this connected app, but I'm not going to do that in this example. Other thing you're going to need is your username, your password, and your security token. I'm not going to go through that for this example. I'm going to assume that you know how to get those, but I'll also post a link on the description of the video to allow you to get those items if you don't know how to. The thing you're going to need is your org URL that you're going to use to authenticate to and get your case information from. From the execute anonymous window, you can run this command, URL get org domain URL, and debug that out. And if you view the logs and select debug only, you can see the actual URL that you're going to use. So in your environment variable, we're going to use that piece. Let's get into the Python that's actually in the AWS Lambda that allows us to retrieve this case information. And it's a lot longer than it should be, but I made a lot of error handling available in this Lambda function. So it's actually simpler than it looks. First, you import JSON, and that's used for any JSON manipulation that we're going to use later on. Import OS used for environment variables that we're going to pull. Import requests. This is the easiest library to use in order to do these REST API requests from the Lambda to Salesforce. And there's a special way to add this layer in your AWS Lambda. I will include the instructions on how to add this library because it's not available by default. It's probably the most important library that we'll use in this example. Then we're going to import logging. That's used to log any information, any errors in our Lambda function. This part declares a logger, and it sets some config for the logger where the level is info. Then we have a function that will retrieve the case data, and you'll notice that it receives a payload, and that payload is the JSON that we're going to send the Lambda, and it will look something like this. It will just have the client ID, and this is the Salesforce ID. So what we're going to do first is we're going to get the client ID from the payload, like so, and then we're going to get all the environment variables that we set up in the first part of this tutorial. So the username of your user that you're going to use to connect to the API, the password, the security token, which will be appended to the password, the instance, which I showed you how to receive in your Salesforce user interface, the client ID and secret, which are the client ID and secret of the connected app, which I've already shown you how to set up. Then you're going to declare your URL that we are going to authorize with, and as you can see, it takes in the Salesforce instance without the HTTPS, remember? So you're going to need to put that Salesforce instance in your environment variable. Similar for the query URL, except now this one uses the services data endpoint, and that actually runs a query which selects the case number and description from case, where the account ID is the client ID which we pass the Lambda function. You're going to need to create some auth headers that we're going to pass the authentication URL, and the auth headers will have a grant type of password, client ID using the client ID that we set up in our environment variables of the client ID of the connected app. Client secret is the client secret of the connected app. Username is your user's username, and your password will be your password concatenated with your security token. Then using your requests library, you will post using the auth URL, and you will get a response out and push it into this variable auth response. Note how we've added data with the auth headers. This authorization endpoint has to use these auth headers in order to authenticate. Out of that, we get an access token from the auth response using the JSON library, and we look for a key called access token. So this variable will then contain the access token. Then we start with the second response, and this part is the data extraction part of it. So the header for this request will contain a header called authorization, starting with bearer, space, and the access token which we just received from the authorization endpoint. We then do a get to the query URL with the header that we just created, and we store the response in this variable query response. This function then returns a query response, and we get the array of records that we received with this query. Now, just to give you an idea of what we're getting there, is this is an example of what the response will be when you retrieve case information. What we're saying there is we're actually retrieving this array of records, so this attribute here. Then here I've got some exception catching for key errors. If there's a key error and in the error there's mention of access token, it means that we have a Salesforce authentication error. Otherwise, we're just getting the incorrect key from the response. We could have a request exception where there's something wrong with our request. I've caught that as well, and I'm logging all these errors using the logger that I've declared at the top. And on the key errors, I'm returning the same string as what I'm logging. So here I'm saying Salesforce authentication error. There I'm saying you're referencing an incorrect key. On the request exception, I'm giving a connection error with the error concatenated. And then any other exceptions, I just specify that there's an unexpected internal server error. Again, logging the error and returning the error for the function. This is the main Lambda handler function. It uses this retrieve case data function. All I do is I declare a variable cases and I assign it to the retrieve case data. I pass event to it. Event contains the payload which we're sending, which contains a client ID. Here I check if what I returned is of a list instance, meaning that I've actually gotten a list of cases from the request, meaning that I got what I needed. So this if checks if that list is empty, then I say there's no case data to assess. If it isn't empty, then I return a status code of 200. If there was no case data, I return a 500. If there is data, I return a 200, and I actually return the JSON of the cases. If what I retrieved for the case data is not an instance of a list, it means something else went wrong, in which case I also return a status code of 500 and I return the actual response that I got from the function here, which could be any of these errors. I hope that simplifies your quest to get data out of Salesforce from a AWS Lambda. If you liked this video, click like and subscribe for future updates.